They were supposed to be erased. The Empire sent everything it had. Fleets, fire, orders that were never meant to be recorded. A night so total in its destruction that the Mandalorians themselves named it the Night of 1,000 Tears. Cities burned. The forges that had produced their armor for thousands of years were melted into rubble. Their people scattered to the furthest edges of the galaxy, hiding their children and their helmets, and the last fragments of a culture that the most powerful government in history had decided should simply stop existing. It did not stop existing. That is the story of Mandalore. Not the battles, though there were thousands of them. Not the Mandalores who led, though their names echo across millennia. The story of Mandalore is the story of a people who were expelled from their first world, who lost their greatest war, who watched their homeworld burned from orbit, and who came back every single time because they carried something that armor could not protect and fire could not reach. They carried the creed, and the creed had no off switch. To understand how a culture survives everything the galaxy throws at it, you have to go back to the very beginning, not to Mandalore the planet. Further than that, it begins on Coruscant, before the city, before the Republic, before almost everything. In the ages before that planet was covered in city, before its surface had been buried under layer after layer of durasteel and transparasteel and the accumulated weight of 1 trillion lives living on top of each other, Coruscant was called by another name. It was called Neutron. And on Neutron, alongside the early humans who were slowly developing the building blocks of what would eventually become galactic civilization, there lived another people, the Taung. They were gray-skinned and formidable in bearing, with features that reflected a lineage shaped by conflict stretching back beyond reliable historical record. They were not a gentle species. They had not been made gentle by their circumstances or their choices. Conflict was not something that had been introduced to them by outside forces or by misfortune. Conflict was simply the condition of their existence, the medium through which they understood themselves and each other, and measured what any individual was worth. And they had been in conflict with the humans of Neutron for longer than either side could accurately remember. The wars between the Taung and the human settlers of ancient Coruscant were not brief. They were not clean. They spanned generations, shifting in their intensity and their character, but never truly stopping, each ceasefire a pause rather than a resolution. The humans had numbers. They reproduced faster, spread more quickly across the planet's surface, and were capable of organizing in ways that gradually and then more rapidly tilted the balance of power against the Taung. But the Taung had something else. They had a relationship with war that the humans around them did not quite share. To the Taung, a battle was not simply a problem to be solved or a danger to be survived. It was a test of something essential in the person fighting it. A chance to discover what you were made of in the only way that truly mattered. They did not fight because they enjoyed destruction for its own sake. They fought because they believed, at a level deep enough to be almost spiritual, that the worth of a person could only be revealed under genuine pressure. That peace was a state you returned to after proving yourself, not a state you simply stayed in and called a life. One battle in particular would be remembered above all others from this ancient conflict. It took place on a continent the humans were already calling Coruscant, and it is now known simply as the Battle of Neutron, though records from that era are fragmentary enough that the details have blurred over thousands of years into something closer to legend than strictly verifiable history. What is clear is that the Taung faced a coalition of human forces that outnumbered them significantly, and that the outcome was not what the Taung had hoped for. They fought with everything they had. They always did. But the weight of numbers eventually told, and when the dust settled, the Taung found themselves on the losing side of a conflict that was not going to reverse itself. The humans were not going to stop growing. Notron was not going to remain a world where two species could fight indefinitely over its surface. The Taung understood this, and rather than continuing a conflict they could not win on a world that was no longer theirs to claim, they made a decision that would define every generation of their descendants forever after. They left. The exodus of the Taung from Notron was not a retreat in the sense that word usually implies. There was no shame attached to it within their culture, no sense of failure that clung to the warriors who made the journey. They were not running from the humans in the way that a defeated people runs. They were going somewhere else to be what they were. Somewhere that would give them the space and the conditions to live by the only rules that felt genuinely real to them. They traveled through space in the era when such travel was still relatively young and the mapped galaxy was smaller than it would become. And eventually they found what they were looking for. A world in the outer rim, a planet of vast forests and open plains and mountain ranges that rose to jagged peaks above ecosystems filled with creatures dangerous enough to make even veteran warriors treat their surroundings with constant respect. A world that had no name yet. A world that they named after the first among them to set foot on its surface and claim it as something that could become theirs. They named it Mandalore. The Mandalore they named it for, the individual at the head of this exodus, was not simply a leader in the conventional sense of that word. The title of Mandalore itself was something different from any rank that the rest of the galaxy would have recognized. It was not inherited by bloodline, though there were later periods where succession passed within families for a time. It was not granted by a council of elders or elected by a popular assembly. The Mandalore was the supreme warrior, the individual who had proven themselves above all others through the processes of their culture, which meant ultimately through combat. To be the Mandalore was to wear the mask of the first, to carry the weight of everything their people meant, to speak for all clans simultaneously, while still being answerable to the ancient code that bound every single one of them. It was a title that demanded constant justification, and the galaxy would learn over thousands of years that anyone who held it was not someone to approach without understanding exactly what they represented. The planet welcomed them in the way that difficult planets welcome people who have nothing to prove to easy ground. Mandalore was not a paradise. Its creatures were dangerous. Its terrain was demanding in ways that made permanent settlement an ongoing project rather than a settled fact, and the process of carving out a civilization on its surface required exactly the kind of sustained effort that the Taung had always believed was the point of living. They built what they needed. They hunted what the planet offered. They fought the wildlife and each other in the ritualized combats that their culture used to settle disputes and establish hierarchy. And slowly, over generations, the planet became theirs in a way that Notron had never been. The Taung did not call themselves Taung anymore. Through a process of cultural self-definition that happened so gradually that no single generation witnessed it occurring, they became simply the Mandalorians, people of Mandalore, the name of the world, and the name of the people becoming the same name. because eventually the distinction stopped being meaningful. What bound them was not species. This would become one of the most significant things to understand about the Mandalorian people as their culture evolved and matured across the centuries. In the earliest years, the Mandalorians were all Taung by blood. But the Taung had always been a people who believed that worth was demonstrated rather than inherited. If a Taung warrior could earn respect through combat and skill and adherence to the code, then logically, so could anyone else. The code itself did not have a species requirement written into it. It had a behavioral requirement. It had a philosophical requirement. It asked things of you rather than asking what you were born as. And so, over the centuries that followed, as the Mandalorians spread beyond their homeworld and encountered other species in the course of their campaigns, something remarkable happened. They absorbed people rather than simply defeating them. Enemies who had fought with enough valor, captives who chose to embrace the creed, individuals from dozens of different species who saw in the Mandalorian way something that answered a need they had always felt but never been able to name. These people became Mandalorian, not metaphorically, not as a second tier of partial membership, as genuine members of the culture with the same rights and the same responsibilities as anyone whose ancestors had made the original journey from Notron. The code they lived by was eventually formalized into what became known as the Raison d'être. 6 actions, 6 requirements that defined what it meant to be Mandalorian in a way that was simple enough to be memorized and deep enough to build an entire civilization around. You wore the armor. You spoke the language. You defended yourself and your family. You raised your children in the way of the creed. You contributed to the clan and its needs. And when the Mandalore called, you answered. These 6 things were not aspirations or ideals that one tried to approximate. They were obligations. They were the minimum, the floor beneath which a Mandalorian could not sink and remain Mandalorian in any meaningful sense. And above that floor was everything else. The honor, the skill, the brotherhood of shared hardship and shared purpose that gave the culture its remarkable cohesion across centuries of separation and across the vast distances of space that eventually separated clan from clan. The armor deserves its own consideration because it was never simply armor in the functional sense. To the Mandalorians, the Beskar iron that their finest suits were forged from represented something that went far beyond physical protection. Every set of armor was a record. It was scratched and dented and repaired across decades of use, and the marks of every battle it had survived were left visible deliberately, because to erase them would be to pretend that those battles had not happened, to disown the history that the wearer carried in the only form that mattered. The armor was passed down through families across generations, accumulating history with every new owner, becoming something like a physical genealogy that could be read by anyone who knew how to look at what they were seeing. When a Mandalorian died, their armor was often the most significant thing they left behind. When a Mandalorian chose to give their armor to someone else, it was a gesture that carried a weight that very few outsiders ever fully understood. The helmet, in particular, with its distinctive T-shaped visor that would eventually become one of the most recognizable shapes in the galaxy, was the face that every Mandalorian presented to the world. Behind it, the individual. In front of it, the warrior. The mask the universe saw when it looked at one of them. The early expansion from Mandalore began not from any particular political calculation, but from something that felt within the culture, like simple necessity. The Mandalorians had built themselves into a warrior society, and a warrior society requires something to test itself against. The creatures of their homeworld were enough for a time. Internal clan conflicts served a purpose, but eventually, the scale of what they had built demanded a larger theater. The Mandalorians began organizing campaigns outward into the Outer Rim, ranging further from their homeworld than previous generations had gone, engaging with other species and other civilizations in conflicts that would expand both their territory and their understanding of the galaxy they inhabited. They were not purely conquests in the conventional sense, driven by a desire for territory or resources as ends in themselves. The Mandalorians wanted to test themselves. They wanted to find opponents who would push them, challenge them, and force them to grow into something better than what they already were. The worlds they encountered were the grounds on which those tests would take place. The campaigns spread across decades and then centuries, becoming known in later historical accounts as the Mandalorian Crusades. Mandalorian warriors swept through the Outer Rim, engaging every species and civilization they found in conflicts that ranged from brief skirmishes resolved in days to sustained wars that lasted years. Some of these species they defeated and moved on from. Some they defeated and absorbed, recognizing in their enemies' fighting spirit exactly the quality that their culture valued above all others. A warrior who fought well against you was not necessarily your enemy forever. A warrior who fought well against you was a potential Mandalorian, if they chose to embrace the creed and accept what it demanded. This mixture of ruthlessness and openness bewildered outside observers, but was internally perfectly consistent. The Mandalorians were not trying to destroy other cultures for the sake of destruction. They were operating according to a worldview in which combat was the universal language, and the outcome of combat was the only truly honest result. If you fought them well enough, you could become one of them. That was the offer, and it was genuine. The cultures that found themselves absorbed by the Mandalorians rather than simply conquered by them were changed profoundly by the experience. But so were the Mandalorians. Every new people brought something with them. Fighting styles that the clans had not encountered. Philosophical perspectives that challenged assumptions which had seemed unquestionable. Technical knowledge that could be incorporated into armor design or military strategy, or the endless and practical science of keeping people alive in difficult environments. The Mandalorians were not static. They were a culture in constant conversation with the galaxy around them, and that conversation was conducted in the only language they fully trusted, which was the language of force and the response to it, and what both revealed about the character of the people involved. There were peoples they encountered who chose death over absorption, who fought until there was nothing left of them, rather than bend to the creed's demands. The Mandalorians respected this in a way that was genuine, if difficult to express without sounding paradoxical. To die well was not failure. To die fighting rather than surrender what you were was, within the framework of values the Mandalorians held, a kind of victory. They would remember the peoples who chose this. They would speak of them afterward with the particular quality of respect reserved for worthy opponents. But the campaigns continued. The galaxy was vast, and their need for testing was not finite. And each new horizon promised something they had not encountered before. The early Mandalorian campaigns established patterns that would persist through all the eras that followed. The clans operated with a degree of autonomy within the broader campaign structure that kept the culture flexible even as it grew larger and more organized. Individual clan leaders made tactical decisions according to their own judgment and the traditions of their particular lineage. The Mandalore provided overall strategic direction and symbolic unity, but did not micromanage the behavior of every unit in the field. This distributed authority structure made the Mandalorian military difficult to fully disrupt even when individual components of it suffered serious losses. You could defeat a clan. You could not easily defeat the idea of what a clan was. The armor technology evolved continuously across this period, driven by the same forces that drove every other aspect of Mandalorian development. Encounters with new species revealed new threats and new materials. Battles against opponents with particular capabilities identified weaknesses that needed to be addressed. The Beskar iron that had become central to their finest work was not infinitely available, and the techniques for working it were closely guarded within the culture and passed from master to apprentice with the same seriousness that the Jedi passed down techniques of lightsaber combat. A fully armored Mandalorian warrior in quality Beskar was formidable in a way that pure combat skill alone could not fully explain. The armor was part of the weapon, part of the fighter, part of what made the whole greater than the sum of the individual parts. The Republic, which by the middle period of the Crusades had established itself as the dominant political structure across much of the known galaxy, watched the Mandalorian expansion with the cautious unease that comes from observing something powerful and largely unpredictable moving in your general direction without appearing to have noticed you directly. Individual clans, individual warbands, individual Mandalores, whose ambitions were significant, but whose reach was geographically limited. The Republic handled these situations through its military and through the Jedi Order that served as its peacekeepers and occasional diplomats. And the encounters, however costly to the worlds directly affected, never escalated to the level of genuine existential threat. But the Mandalorians were growing. Their campaigns had given them experience and resources and a kind of organizational momentum that made each successive generation more formidable than the last. And the galaxy, in its infinite capacity for producing circumstances that would test every people eventually, was already preparing the conditions under which that growth would be fully displayed. It was in this period of expanding Mandalorian capability that the galaxy entered one of its most turbulent and devastating historical eras. The Sith, ancient enemies of the Jedi and of the Republic they served, had never been truly extinguished in any of the periods when the larger galaxy believed they had been. They had fractured and reformed and changed their shapes across millennia of conflict, each new iteration claiming the legacy of an old darkness and adding new dimensions to it. In the era that historians would come to call the time of the Great Sith War, a Jedi whose name would be spoken with a particular weight for centuries afterward had fallen to the dark side and risen to become a Dark Lord. His name was Exar Kun. He had gathered followers and ancient knowledge and the will to use both, and he had launched a campaign against the Republic and the Jedi that would leave scars that took generations to fully heal. Exar Kun understood that to succeed against an opponent the size of the Republic required allies, and he looked toward the Outer Rim for them. The Mandalore of that era carried a title that reflected the ambitions of his time and his person. He was Mandalore the Indomitable, and the name was not mere performance. He had risen to the leadership of the clans through exactly the processes his culture demanded, and he led a warrior nation at what felt like the height of its reach and its confidence. When Exar Kun's representatives approached him and proposed an alliance, Mandalore the Indomitable did not agree because he had been deceived about the risks or was unclear about the nature of what he was entering into. He agreed because the offer made sense within his worldview in the most direct possible terms. A war against the Republic would be the greatest test the Mandalorians had ever faced. The Republic was the largest, most powerful political entity in the known galaxy, defended by armies and by the Jedi Order, with all its force-wielding traditions. To fight such an enemy alongside an ally who could offer his own advantages was not madness. It was the kind of ambition that Mandalorian culture had always been designed to accommodate. The Mandalorians entered the Great Sith War effectively as Exar Kun's heavy forces, a striking arm of armored warriors hitting where the Republic's defenses were thinnest, and drawing attention that might otherwise have focused on the Sith's central operations. They were effective in this role. Mandalorian forces struck multiple worlds across the Outer Rim and pushed toward the Mid-Rim, winning engagements against Republic defense forces that consistently underestimated the coordinated ferocity of Mandalorians fighting as a unified military rather than as raiders. But the alliance between Kun and Mandalore the Indomitable was always one of mutual convenience rather than genuine partnership. And when the Great Sith War turned against Kun, when the combined effort of the Jedi Order and the Republic military began to dismantle the structures he had built, the consequences were not contained only to the Sith side of the alliance. The battle that would mark the end of Mandalore the Indomitable's story took place over and on the surface of Onderon, a world in the Mid-Rim that carried its own long and complex history of conflict. It was not the battle he would have chosen, or the terrain he would have selected, given perfect conditions. The Republic forces that engaged him there fought with the desperate determination that comes from defending something rather than conquering it. Mandalore the Indomitable fell at Onderon. The circumstances of his death were not the kind that Mandalorian culture idealized as the perfect ending for a great warrior. He was not defeated in single combat by a clearly defined equal under conditions where the outcome could be read as the honest verdict of the universe on two individuals. The battle consumed him the way battles sometimes consume even the greatest warriors, through an accumulation of factors rather than through any single decisive moment. He was gone, and with him went the coherent command structure of a unified Mandalorian military alliance. The clans absorbed this defeat with the particular quality of resilience that had always characterized the culture. Not denial. Not the kind of collapse that comes when an organization's identity is too closely tied to a particular outcome. A grim and practical acknowledgement that this was what war was, that defeat was a part of the test rather than the end of it, and that the culture that had produced Mandalore the Indomitable could and would produce another. The loss at Onderon was real. The damage to their military organization was real, but none of it destroyed what the Mandalorians fundamentally were. A culture built around the expectation of adversity does not shatter when adversity arrives. It notes what happened, extracts whatever can be learned, and continues. In the aftermath of the Great Sith War, the Mandalorian clans entered a period of recalibration. The loss of Mandalore the Indomitable had left the question of succession open in the way it always was when a Mandalore fell in combat, to be resolved through the internal processes of the culture rather than through any external political mechanism. Clans gathered and assessed and debated and eventually aligned behind whoever had earned sufficient standing to claim the title. The galaxy around them was busy in its own recovery from the devastation that Exar Kun had caused across multiple systems, and the Republic was absorbed in its own reconstruction rather than attending to the long-term implications of what a reorganized Mandalorian culture might eventually mean. This gave the Mandalorians space that they used productively. The warrior who eventually rose to claim the title in the years following the Great Sith War carried a name that was itself a declaration of intent, explicit enough to border on challenge. He called himself Mandalore the Ultimate. The name was not chosen casually or as simple vanity. It was an expression of a specific vision he held for what his leadership would accomplish and what it would mean in the long history of his people. He was not content with previous definitions of Mandalorian greatness. He was not satisfied by the scope of what any previous Mandalore had achieved, however impressive those achievements were within their own context. He believed that all of what the culture had been building toward across its entire history was not yet accomplished, that the test the Mandalorians had always been preparing for had not yet arrived, and that the leader who would bring them to that test was him. Historians looking back at this period consistently note the quality of his organizational thinking, his ability to unify clans that had been operating independently of each other, and his instinct for military preparation on a scale that no previous Mandalore had attempted with the same degree of systematic planning. What historians also note, with the benefit of perspective not available to anyone living through the events, is that Mandalore the Ultimate was being shaped by forces he did not know existed. Hidden behind layers of deception so carefully constructed that they would not be understood for decades, there was an influence at work on his ambitions. The Sith Emperor, a being who had achieved a form of dark side immortality through acts so horrifying that the worlds where they had occurred would carry the marks of them for millennia, was patiently building towards something on a timescale that most beings could not hold in their minds simultaneously. He had identified the Mandalorians as a useful instrument in his preparations, not as a genuine ally with shared goals, but as a weapon that could be pointed at a target. If the Mandalorians could be directed against the Republic, the resulting war would bleed the Republic of resources and military capability, while simultaneously keeping the Emperor's true strength and location hidden in the unknown regions. The Emperor sent an agent, a Sith, who carried his master's authority and a carefully crafted vision of destiny, and who made contact with Mandalore the Ultimate through channels subtle enough to leave no obvious trace. The manipulation that followed was effective precisely because it did not need to create anything false in Mandalore the Ultimate. Everything the agent offered was something that was already there. The Mandalorian leader genuinely believed in the greatness of his people. He genuinely believed they deserved a larger and more significant stage than the Outer Rim could offer. He genuinely wanted to lead them into the test that would define them. The agent simply shaped these existing drives toward a particular target and provided a particular framing for what conflict with the Republic would mean. This would not be another campaign in the Outer Rim. This would not be opportunistic raiding of frontier worlds. This would be the war. The Mandalorian people against the most powerful institution in the known galaxy fought at full strength and with full organizational commitment, and the outcome would tell the truth about whether everything the culture had built since the first Mandalore set foot on their planet had been worth building. Within that framing, the war was not something imposed on Mandalore the Ultimate from outside. It was something he chose with everything he was. The Neo-Crusaders were the expression of this vision in organizational form. Mandalore, the Ultimate, understood that the clan structure that had served the Mandalorians well in smaller, and more localized conflicts would not be sufficient for a sustained campaign against the Republic across multiple fronts simultaneously. He did not eliminate the clan system. The clans were too fundamental to Mandalorian identity, too deeply woven into how individuals understood their place and their loyalties, to be removed without destroying the very thing he was trying to lead. But he layered on top of the clan structure a unified military organization whose members wore standardized armor in the colors he had chosen for the cause, and fought according to shared tactical doctrine rather than individual clan tradition. The distinctive coloring of the Neo-Crusader armor became one of the defining visual images of the era, recognizable across the Outer Rim and eventually feared across the Republic's frontier worlds as the advance force of something much larger. The gathering of forces happened with a patience that matched the scale of what was being planned. Mandalore the Ultimate established his primary base of operations on Dixun, the dangerous moon orbiting Onderon, the same world where Mandalore the Indomitable had fallen. The choice was deliberate in multiple senses. Dixun was among the most hostile environments in the sector, its wildlife so aggressive and its terrain so unforgiving that simply surviving there was a form of constant training. Its distance from major Republic intelligence networks meant that the scale of what was assembling there was slow to register with anyone who might have acted to prevent it. And there was something else in the choice of Dion, a symbolic weight that Mandalorian culture was sensitive to in ways that outsiders rarely appreciated. To build on the moon associated with a predecessor's defeat was to take that defeat and turn it into a foundation. To say that this was the place where the next chapter began. The warriors who answered Mandalore the Ultimate's call came from every part of the Mandalorian cultural universe. Old clans whose lineages stretched back to the earliest Crusades, newer clans formed by absorption during more recent campaigns, whose members had joined the culture within living memory, but embraced the creed with the particular intensity that often characterizes those who have chosen an identity rather than simply inherited one. Independent warriors who had been making their way as mercenaries across the Outer Rim and who heard the call and found that they could not refuse it, because whatever else the dispersed years had been, they had been years of waiting for exactly this. The gathering on Dixun was not simply a military assembly. It was a cultural event of the First Order, a moment when the Mandalorian people looked at themselves and recognized, in the scope of what was assembling, evidence that the years between the wars had not in fact diminished what they were. The training on Dixun was brutal by any standard that outsiders would have applied. But by Mandalorian standards, it was simply thorough. The moon's predators, some of which were large enough to threaten even a fully armored warrior, provided practical training that no simulation could replicate. The constant pressure of surviving in that environment meant that warriors arrived at the actual war already conditioned in ways that their Republic counterparts were not. Beyond the physical preparation, the gathering allowed for something equally important: the development of shared tactical language across clans that had been operating independently for decades. The Neo-Crusader doctrine required that different clans coordinate their actions in battle, and this could not happen through assumption or tradition alone. It required deliberate work, and Mandalore the Ultimate oversaw it with the patience of someone who understood that the campaign he was planning would not be won by individual valor alone. When the Mandalorians finally struck, the Republic was unprepared in the specific and painful way that large, Stable organizations are always unprepared for something they have convinced themselves is being adequately managed. There had been intelligence about Mandalorian movements. There had been reports of unusual levels of clan organization and activity in the Outer Rim. There had been a general awareness among Republic military planners that something was happening at a scale larger than typical Mandalorian raiding behavior. But the assumption had been that this was another campaign in the Outer Rim. Larger than normal perhaps, but still fundamentally the same pattern of behavior the Republic had dealt with and managed before. The assumption was catastrophically wrong. The initial Mandalorian strikes crossed multiple systems simultaneously, hitting the Outer Rim in a coordinated pattern that demonstrated strategic sophistication well beyond what Republic military commanders had expected to face. The worlds targeted first were not the strongest points on the Republic's frontier. They were the weakest. Planets still recovering from the damage of the Great Sith War. Their populations not yet fully returned to normalcy. Their defense forces stretched thin, and their infrastructure still in the process of being rebuilt. The selection of targets was not random and not simply opportunistic. It revealed something important about the kind of war Mandalore the Ultimate intended to fight. This was not an assault on the Republic's strength. It was a systematic dismantling of its structure, beginning at the places most vulnerable and working inward, using each victory to generate momentum for the next. The Mandalorian advance in the war's early phase was genuinely devastating. World after world fell before Neo-Crusader forces that moved with a speed and coordination that consistently exceeded what Republic defenders had prepared for. The Mandalorians swept through their targets, taking what was useful, recruiting willing fighters into their ranks from the populations they encountered, establishing enough of a hold to maintain what had been taken while the main campaign pressed forward. The speed was part of the strategic design. Speed created panic across the Republic's political structures, and panic made effective defense harder. Senators were frightened. Systems were questioning whether the Republic could protect them. The war was being won simultaneously on military and political fronts. The Jedi Order observed the early Mandalorian advance with a collective anguish that expressed itself controversially as restraint. The High Council, still carrying the memories of the Great Sith War and the toll that conflict had extracted from the Order, counseled against direct intervention. The arguments offered were not entirely without substance. The Jedi were peacekeepers by tradition, rather than soldiers by design. The Republic military had been built precisely for situations like this one, and there were council members who felt with a certainty they could not fully articulate that the Mandalorian advance was not the complete picture of what was occurring, that something larger was operating beneath the surface of events. They feared that rushing into the conflict directly could play into hands that had not yet revealed themselves. The Council held back and counseled patience, and the border worlds continued to burn. For the younger Jedi, watching this from within the Order, the Council's position felt like something much worse than caution. A Jedi Knight named Revan, who had already established a reputation for the quality of his strategic mind and the depth of his Force connection, became the voice of those who could not accept the Council's position. He argued with a clarity that made the opposing view seem suddenly inadequate. That the Jedi Code did not permit standing aside while innocent populations died because the situation was politically complicated. When the Council maintained its decision, Revan gathered those who agreed with him and went to war anyway. The group that followed him became known as the Revanchists. Among them was his closest friend, a Jedi named Malak. Together, they brought to the Republic military something it had been lacking. Not simply force capability, though that was significant. What they brought was strategic vision of a quality the Mandalorians had not anticipated encountering. Revan studied the enemy the way a scholar studies a subject they intend to master. He did not approach the Mandalorian war machine as an obstacle to be overcome through superior force. He approached it as a system with internal logic that could be mapped and then used against itself. The Mandalorians valued direct confrontation. Their culture elevated single combat and the decisive engagement above tactical deception and strategic patience. They believed in fighting what was in front of you, and they were extraordinary at it. Revan recognized this and built his strategies around it, offering the Mandalorians engagements that appeared to be what their cultural instincts called for while being arranged quite differently beneath the surface. He was willing to make decisions that a Jedi trained in the traditional manner would have struggled to justify. He accepted heavy casualties when the broader strategic situation required it. He allowed battles to be lost in order to win the campaign. He wore a mask throughout the war, and behind that mask, he became something that existing categories struggled to contain. The war that followed Revan's intervention was not a swift reversal of Mandalorian momentum. It was a grinding, sustained campaign that unfolded over years, with significant losses on both sides and moments where the outcome remained genuinely uncertain, but the momentum shifted. Republic forces began winning engagements that previously they had been losing, and they began winning them through methods that forced Mandalorian commanders to adapt to conditions their cultural preparation had not fully addressed. The Force users among Revan's revanchists added a dimension to Republic military capability that the Mandalorians had not faced in the same concentrated way before, and overseeing it all was a commander who had become genuinely difficult to predict, which was perhaps the most dangerous thing any opponent of the Mandalorians could be. The climax came at Malachor V, a world on the edge of known space that would carry the weight of what happened there forever afterward. Revan drew the main Mandalorian fleet to that planet through a sequence of strategic moves designed to give Mandalore the Ultimate the appearance of the decisive engagement he had always believed the war would eventually come down to. The trap closed with the activation of a weapon that had no precedent in Republic military history: the Mass Shadow Generator, a device of such devastating capability that deploying it required accepting the death of thousands of your own soldiers alongside the enemy's. Revan's general, Mitra Surik, activated it on his orders. The Mass Shadow Generator created gravitational anomalies of catastrophic force above and across the surface of Malachor. It tore the Mandalorian fleet apart. It destroyed a significant portion of the Republic fleet as well. Ships fell from orbit and struck the planet's surface. The ground itself fractured under forces it could not sustain. In moments that survivors would struggle to describe for the rest of their lives, the battle ceased to be a battle and became a disaster of such proportion that the surviving Mandalorians, watching their fleet consumed and their forces annihilated simultaneously from above and below, transmitted their surrender. Revan descended to the surface and faced Mandalore the Ultimate in the single combat that Mandalorian tradition demanded as the final resolution. The duel was fierce. Mandalore the Ultimate was everything the title suggested. But Revan had been changed by the war in ways that had made him more than he had been at its beginning. He won, and in the dying Mandalore's last moments, the truth came out. The manipulation, the Sith agent, the hidden hand that had shaped the entire campaign, a name and coordinates that would redirect Revan's life entirely, away from what had just been accomplished, and towards something he now understood was far larger. Revan took the mask of Mandalore, the ultimate. This was not a simple trophy claimed by a victor over a fallen enemy. The mask was the symbol of the Mandalore's authority over all clans. Without it, no successor could claim full legitimacy in the way that Mandalorian tradition demanded. Revan understood this perfectly and took it with the deliberateness of someone who intended the consequence. He had just ended the largest Mandalorian military campaign in living memory. He intended the ending to hold, and, for a time, it did. The Mandalorian people, stripped of their supreme symbol of unity, would have to find their way through a darkness unlike any they had faced before. Not the darkness of a war they were losing, but the more patient and more grinding darkness of a peace that had been imposed on them by someone else's hand. The Mandalorian Wars ended, and the galaxy moved on in the way that galaxies move on from concluded catastrophes, turning its collective attention toward what came next, which in this era was Revan himself becoming a different kind of threat, and then a sequence of crises that followed each other with the relentless logic of histories, where one event's resolution creates the conditions for the next. For the Mandalorian people, the world did not move on with anything like the same momentum. They were left with the consequences of Malachor in ways that went deeper than the tactical and the political. The surviving Mandalorian warriors found themselves in a situation that their culture had almost no framework for navigating. They had fought the greatest war in their history, and they had lost it conclusively. Their fleet was gone. Their best warriors were dead or scattered across the outer rim. Their Mandalore had fallen in single combat on a planet whose surface had been broken by a weapon their enemy had been willing to use on his own people as the price of victory. And the mask, the physical object that carried the authority of the Mandalore and made the unity of all clans more than an aspiration, was gone. Revan had taken it and gone wherever the coordinates the dying Mandalore had given him led, and without the mask, no claimant to the title could make their claim hold across the full extent of Mandalorian culture. The mask's absence was not merely symbolic, though the symbolic weight was enormous. It was structural. The Mandalorians were a people whose system of unity depended on a specific form of legitimacy, and that form had been taken from them. Revan's terms of surrender had been designed with a particular understanding of what would disable rather than simply what would punish. The Mandalorians were required to give up their weapons and their armor. They were required to destroy their basilisk war droids, the terrifying combat mounts that had been one of the most recognizable and feared elements of their military. For a culture in which armor was not equipment but identity, in which the physical object of a set of Beskar iron represented a warrior's entire history in tangible form, giving it up was not simply a military concession. It was something much closer to an amputation of self. Warriors who had never been defeated in single combat handed over the expression of everything they were because the war had been lost and the terms had to be honored. That was the creed. You did not pretend a defeat had not happened. Most complied. Some could not, and disappeared into the outer rim carrying whatever they could before the terms could be applied to them. But most complied. The years that followed became known within Mandalorian cultural memory as a period of dispersal, though the word that came closest to capturing it in their own language carried connotations of something more like waiting than like defeat. Many Mandalorian warriors became mercenaries in this period, which was an honorable trade within the culture rather than a fall from it. Warriors without a war sell their skills. That was understood and acceptable. But it was different from what the Mandalorian people had been at the height of the Neo-Crusader organization. The difference was not simply one of scale. It was one of purpose. Individual warriors or small groups working for whoever paid them were doing something that looked like what Mandalorians did without quite being what Mandalorians did in the fullest sense. The coherence was gone. The sense of participating in something vast and purposeful that gave a warrior's individual actions their full meaning within the culture was absent, replaced by the smaller and more personal satisfactions of professional work done well. The clan system persisted because it was too fundamental to Mandalorian identity to dissolve, simply because the political superstructure above it had collapsed. Families stayed together. Groups that had fought alongside each other across years of the war maintained their connections. The basic unit of Mandalorian social organization had always been durable in ways that larger structures were not. But without the mask, and without a true Mandalore to give the clans common direction and shared purpose, the culture existed in a condition of suspension. All the components were present. All the traditions were remembered and practiced within individual clans. All the values were intact in the minds and habits of people who still rose before dawn and trained and lived by the code, even when no grand campaign demanded that they do so. But the thing that turned the components into a functioning whole was absent, and the galaxy was not providing obvious opportunities to reclaim it. The Mandalorian identity survived the long silence, in the way that all genuinely deep identities survive extended periods of adversity by becoming more internal. When the external markers of what you are have been stripped away, what remains is what was always true beneath them. The Mandalorians could not wear their armor openly in many of the contexts where they now lived and worked. They could not gather under their own banner or fight for their own cause. But they could still speak the language among themselves. They could still raise their children according to the code. They could still carry the memory of what the culture had been and would be again. And they could still recognize each other across crowded spaceports and anonymous cantinas in the outer reaches of the galaxy. Because some things about a person do not change regardless of what they are wearing or what name they are working under. A Mandalorian knew another Mandalorian. The long silence was long, but it was not permanent. Somewhere in the galaxy, a warrior named Canderous Ordo was waiting without knowing exactly what he was waiting for. Somewhere in the unknown regions, a mask that had belonged to the greatest Mandalorian leader of the age was being carried by a man who had taken it not out of malice, but out of strategy. The creed endured, the culture endured, and history, which had never once in its long record left the Mandalorians alone for very long, was already beginning to turn back in their direction. Among the warriors scattered across the outer rim by the aftermath of Malachor was one whose future significance to the culture's recovery could not have been predicted from his circumstances at the time. His name was Canderous Ordo, of Clan Ordo, one of the great clans in Mandalorian history. He had fought in the war with the distinction his culture valued. He had been present at significant engagements. He had survived things that killed people around him. And in the years after the war, he had done what his kind did when the grand campaigns were over. He had taken mercenary work and tried to find a way to live that maintained some relationship to what he had been. He was, in these years, not yet the figure he would become. He was a Mandalorian warrior in a time without a Mandalore, doing what Mandalorian warriors had always done in the absence of a great cause. He was waiting, though he might not have named it as waiting. He was preserving something in himself against the day when it would be needed again. The Force does not leave such situations static forever, and neither does history. The mask existed somewhere. Revan knew where it was, and the galaxy would eventually require the Mandalorians in the way it had always periodically required them, as something that no other people could provide, a culture that faced fear and difficulty and genuine threat with a philosophy that had been specifically and consciously built around exactly those conditions. The dispersal was not an ending. In Mandalorian understanding, nothing that the culture itself survived could be called an ending. There were only pauses between tests, and the creed that had endured everything from the exodus off Notron to the shattering at Malachor had now endured something more subtle and in some ways more difficult than either of those. It had endured the enforced quiet of a people whose capacity for war had been deliberately blunted, whose symbols had been taken and whose structures had been dismantled. And it had endured this the same way it endured everything else, by remaining itself. The creed did not live in the mask. The creed lived in every person who had ever spoken its words and meant them, and those people were still out there, waiting, remembering, and quietly, in their own ways and in their own time, beginning to find each other again. There were Mandalorians who spent the years of the long silence doing something that might have surprised outside observers who carried fixed assumptions about what the culture valued. They were writing things down, not battle records, though those existed too, but philosophy, explorations of what the creed meant and why it had survived, what had just happened to it, and what precisely it required of people who intended to continue living by it when the external structures that normally organized Mandalorian life were absent. These documents, most of them informal and scattered across clan archives that were themselves scattered across the Outer Rim, became an unexpected record of a culture in conversation with itself during one of the most difficult periods it had ever faced. They showed a people who were not simply warriors unable to function without a war to fight. They showed a people who had always had a philosophy beneath the fighting, and who were now having to articulate that philosophy more explicitly than they had ever needed to before, because the fighting had been taken away and what remained had to be enough. The mercenary work that sustained many Mandalorian warriors during these years was not without its own lessons. Working for different employers across different contexts exposed Mandalorian fighters to the full diversity of how the galaxy organized conflict. And conflict was a subject they had always studied with professional seriousness. They observed Republic military doctrine and its weaknesses. They observed the various criminal organizations and independent powers of the Outer Rim and what it looked like when violence was organized around profit rather than philosophy. They fought alongside non-Mandalorians and noted which qualities in those fighters were worth respecting and which habits were the product of cultures that had not thought seriously about what they were doing and why. All of this accumulated in the culture the same way experience always had, through observation and conversation, and the slow adjustment of understanding that comes from being tested against reality rather than against theory alone. The children born during the long silence were a generation raised in unusual circumstances by Mandalorian standards. They grew up in smaller units, without the vast organized campaigns that would normally have defined the backdrop of childhood for warriors' offspring. They were raised by the code, but without the direct experience of what the code looked like when it was expressing itself at full scale. Some historians have wondered whether this generation's different formation would produce a weaker relationship to the tradition. The historical record suggests the opposite. The children who grew up hearing their parents and grandparents speak about what the Mandalorians had been and what they were meant to be, without the distraction of an active war to make the conversation unnecessary, developed a relationship to the Creed's philosophy that was, in some ways, more articulate and more consciously held than the generation that had fought at Malachor. They had been taught deliberately and explicitly, not simply shown by example. And what is taught with that kind of intentionality tends to be held with a particular tenacity across the years that follow. Canderous Ordo had seen the inside of enough cantinas in enough outer rim cities by the time events began to shift that he had stopped expecting anything unusual from any of them. The mercenary work had been consistent, if not fulfilling. He was good at what he did in the way that people are good at things they have been doing for a long time under conditions that demanded genuine competence or genuine suffering. And he had always preferred competence. His reputation carried him to jobs that paid well and required a specific kind of capability that only a limited number of people in the galaxy could honestly offer. He was not hiding. He was not diminished. But anyone who had known him in the years of the Neo-Crusader campaign and encountered him in this period would have recognized, beneath the professional effectiveness, something that the Mandalorian language had a word for, but that common galactic basic did not translate cleanly. It referred to the condition of a warrior who is fully capable and fully inactive and fully aware of both facts simultaneously. The word implied no shame, but it implied a weight. What changed was Revan, or more precisely, what changed was that Revan came back into the part of the galaxy where Canderous Ordo was operating. And when he did, he brought with him something that shifted the calculus of everything. Revan had returned from wherever the coordinates given to him by the dying Mandalore the Ultimate had led. And he had come back, changed in ways that even those close to him struggled to fully describe. He had encountered the Emperor. He had been captured and had his mind altered and had found his way back to himself through a process that no straightforward account could do justice to. But some things from before his capture remained, including the understanding of what the Mandalorians were and what they could be, and including the mask. He had kept it. And now, with the galaxy once again facing threats of a scale that demanded every capable force be organized and deployed, he understood that a fractured and leaderless Mandalorian culture was a resource left unused at a time when no resource could be afforded to sit idle. Revan found Canderous, and he gave him the mask. The gesture carried the full weight of everything the mask represented, and both men understood this without requiring elaboration. The mask of Mandalore the Ultimate, the symbol that Revan had taken at Malachor to prevent immediate successor claims, was now being given back. Not to the culture at large, not yet. To one man with a purpose attached to it. Revan's instructions were direct in the way that Revan's communications tended to be direct. When he had made up his mind about something, gather the clans, rebuild what had been scattered, find the lost, and remind them what they were. Prepare, because what was coming would require every Mandalorian who could still hold a weapon and remember what it meant to fight for something beyond payment. Canderous Ordo accepted the mask and the task with the economy of response that characterized people who have spent years being ready for something they did not know they were ready for. What followed was one of the most significant undertakings in the cultural history of the Mandalorian people. Quiet enough that the larger galaxy barely registered it while it was happening, but profound enough that its effects would be felt across generations. Canderous returned to Dxun. He established a camp there among the ruins of Mandalore, the Ultimate's original base. which was itself a statement about continuity and about the refusal to let what had been destroyed remain only destroyed. Deegzoon's wildlife was unchanged. The moon was as hostile as it had ever been, as demanding of constant alertness and genuine physical capability as the first warriors who had trained there had found it. This was precisely the point. A base that required its inhabitants to be warriors, simply to survive from day to day, was not a drawback. It was a feature. He sent out word through the networks that Mandalorian warriors maintained even through the scattered years, the contacts built through mercenary work, and the informal connections of clan members who knew other clan members across the wide dispersal of the post-war period. The message was not elaborate. It did not need to be. A Mandalore had been named. The mask had been found and claimed by someone who had earned the right to carry it through every measure the culture possessed. Those who still held the creed as something real rather than as a memory of something that had once been real, knew what was being asked of them and where they needed to go. They came, not in the torrents that had answered Mandalore the Ultimate's call at the height of the Neo-Crusader mobilization. This was a quieter gathering, smaller and more deliberate, shaped by the years of dispersal in ways that the earlier call had not been. But they came. Among those who answered were warriors from the great clans whose names had been part of Mandalorian history since the earliest Crusades. Clan Ordo itself, naturally, rallying to its own leader, Clan Skirata, carrying traditions that stretched back through decades of mercenary service without losing any of the philosophical depth that made them distinctly Mandalorian rather than simply effective fighters for hire. Clan Ren, whose members had distributed themselves across multiple sectors during the long silence, and who now converged on Deegzoon from distances that would have been daunting to anyone without the Mandalorian relationship to hard journeys. Smaller clans, some of whose membership could be counted in family units rather than in battle groups, came because the call had reached them, and the creed demanded that they answer it when a true Mandalore spoke. Canderous took the name Mandalore the Preserver. The title was not chosen carelessly. It was a direct statement about the purpose of this particular Mandalore's leadership at this particular moment. Not expansion, not the grand campaigns of conquest that had defined so many previous eras. Preservation, the maintenance of what the culture was against all the forces that had worked to diminish or erase it. The preservation of the creed, the clans, the language, the armor tradition, the philosophy of the Rezolner. This Mandalore was not called to lead the greatest war in Mandalorian history. He was called to ensure that the people who would fight that and every future war remained genuinely Mandalorian in the fullest sense, that the culture survived its worst period intact enough to be worth continuing. The work at Deegzoon was not glamorous by the standards of what Mandalorian history celebrated most loudly. There were no great battles in this rebuilding period, no engagements against overwhelming odds that would be told and retold across campfires for generations. There was the slower and more demanding work of teaching, of resolving the conflicts that inevitably arose when proud warriors from clans with their own traditions and their own accumulated grievances had to learn to operate together again under a shared structure. There was the work of recovering what had been lost during the dispersal, traditions that had only survived in fragments, techniques that existed now only in the memories of old warriors who needed to be found and listened to before those memories were gone. There was the work of making clear to a generation of Mandalorians who had grown up during the long silence that what they had been taught about who they were was not simply their parents' nostalgia for a better time. It was real. It was what they were, and it would be required of them. The larger galactic context in which Mandalore the Preserver did this rebuilding work was, characteristically, not peaceful. The Republic and the remnants of the Sith forces loyal to Revan's old empire were in the middle of a conflict that would eventually resolve into something new and equally troubled. The Jedi were navigating their own crisis. The aftermath of Malachor and the loss of so many Force-sensitive individuals, having created wounds in the Order that had not healed cleanly. And deeper in the shadows, the Sith Emperor who had orchestrated the Mandalorian Wars was still present in his fortress in the unknown regions, still patient, still building toward whatever final expression of his ambitions he intended to eventually reveal. The galaxy was not resting. Even when particular conflicts reached pauses that could be mistaken for endings by people who needed to believe that things resolved cleanly. The Mandalorian place in all of this was complicated in ways that the culture's internal clarity about its own values did not fully resolve. The creed was clear. The code was clear. But the galaxy it had to be practiced in was a tangled web of competing powers and ambiguous allegiances and rapidly shifting circumstances. Mandalore the Preserver navigated these complications with the particular pragmatism of someone who has survived enough of the galaxy's complexity to understand that idealism applied without judgment tends to get the idealist, everyone who depends on them, killed. He maintained the independence of the culture even while being willing to coordinate with outside forces when the coordination served Mandalorian interests and did not compromise Mandalorian integrity. He was not isolationist. Isolation had never been the Mandalorian way. But he was careful in ways that previous Mandalores in the Great Campaign eras had not needed to be. Over the years that followed, the culture rebuilt in the way that genuinely resilient things rebuild, not by returning to exactly what they had been before, but by becoming something that carried all of what had been before, while incorporating the hard-won knowledge of the period of loss. The Mandalorian people who emerged from the rebuilding at Desun were not identical to the Neo-Crusader force that had nearly brought the Republic to its knees. They were smaller in number for a time. They were more internally focused in their immediate concerns. But the philosophy was intact. The traditions were intact. And the fundamental character of the culture, its relationship to hardship and to combat and to identity and to the bonds of clan and creed, had not been fundamentally altered by everything it had been through. It had been tested. It had survived the test. That was, within the framework of Mandalorian values, precisely what was supposed to happen. The centuries between the era of Mandalore the Preserver and the period that the larger galaxy called the New Sith Wars were not empty centuries for the Mandalorian people, though the historical record of those years, as it pertains specifically to Mandalore, is less detailed than the more dramatic eras on either side of them. The clans grew. The culture spread across the Mandalorian sector and beyond. The homeworld itself, which had existed somewhat in the background of the culture's story during the period when most of the significant events were happening elsewhere, became more central again. As the population stabilized and the governance structures of the culture developed to meet the needs of a people that now had something closer to a settled home to protect alongside the nomadic traditions that had always been part of who they were. Mandalorian mercenary companies continued to operate across the galaxy because the demand for highly trained and thoroughly reliable fighters did not diminish in a galaxy that remained structurally prone to conflict, and because the income from that work and the experience it provided continued to serve the culture's development in practical ways. The New Sith Wars, which unfolded across an extended period spanning centuries of the Old Republic era, were not a single conflict, but rather a sustained period of recurring Sith resurgence and Republic response that produced so many distinct campaigns and crises that historians have organized them into phases rather than treating the whole as a unified event. The Mandalorians were present in various capacities throughout this long and exhausting period. At different moments and under different Mandalores whose names and accomplishments the historical record preserves with varying degrees of completeness, the clans fought on different sides of different conflicts. They were mercenaries employed by both Republic and Sith-aligned forces at different points. They were occasionally independent actors, pursuing their own territorial or cultural interests in the spaces opened by the larger conflict's demands on Republic military attention. They were, in a few notable instances, the deciding factor in engagements that turned on which side had the superior shock troops and the greater willingness to absorb punishment in the execution of difficult objectives. What the long arc of the new Sith Wars did to the Mandalorian culture was something that could not easily be seen in any single campaign, but that accumulated into a significant shift across the centuries. The Mandalorian homeworld, the planet that the culture had shaped and been shaped by since the original Taung exodus from Notron, increasingly became the center of gravity for a people who had always been somewhat nomadic in their identity. The great forests that had covered its surface in earlier eras had been altered significantly by the history of battles fought across them, and the surface itself bore the marks of conflicts that had touched it directly over the long centuries. The culture had built cities there, actual settled cities, rather than simply encampments of warriors between campaigns. And those cities had their own character, shaped by the Mandalorian philosophical tradition, but also by the practical requirements of housing and feeding and organizing a civilian population that was more than simply a reserve military force waiting to be mobilized. This settling, this development of a genuinely planetary civilization on Mandalore itself, created something new in the culture's long history. It created something to lose that was different in kind from what had been at stake before. In the early Crusade eras, the Mandalorians had been a largely mobile culture whose most precious possessions were their armor and their creed and their bonds to each other. These things were portable. You carried them with you. A world taken from you was a temporary setback because the culture existed in the people rather than in the geography. But as Mandalore the planet became more thoroughly developed and more thoroughly home in the deepest sense of that word, the stakes of conflict involving the homeworld changed in ways that the culture was still, across those centuries, working out how to think about and incorporate into its existing framework. The Mandalorian civil wars of later eras would not be comprehensible without understanding this shift. A people who had always defined themselves entirely by their creed and their capacity for war now had, in the development of their homeworld, a resource of a different kind. They had a civilization with aesthetic and philosophical dimensions that were not purely martial. They had art forms, architectural traditions, systems of governance more complex than pure clan hierarchy, and a civilian population that participated in the culture's identity without being warriors in the traditional sense. This was not a betrayal of what the Mandalorians had always been. Many within the culture understood it as the natural development of what the creed had always implied. The Rezolna asked you to raise your children in the way of Mandalore, and children raised across generations in a settled civilization with its own institutions would inevitably develop dimensions of that civilization's character alongside the warrior tradition. but not everyone saw it this way. And the tension between those who did and those who did not would eventually produce one of the most painful conflicts in the culture's history. The events leading to what would later be called the Mandalorian Civil War did not emerge suddenly. They built across years of political development on the homeworld that gradually clarified the division between two fundamentally different visions of what the Mandalorian people were supposed to be. On one side were those who had come to believe that the warrior tradition, while part of the culture's heritage, needed to be placed in a new relationship with the ideals of peace and political neutrality that the modern galaxy seemed to demand of any people who wanted to avoid becoming instruments of larger powers' ambitions. These were the new Mandalorians, and their political expression found its sharpest and most articulate form in a woman whose name would become one of the most debated in Mandalorian history. Her name was Satine Kryze, and she would eventually become the Duchess of Mandalore. Satine had grown up in circumstances shaped by the violence that the warrior tradition could produce when turned inward, when the Mandalorian capacity for organized and systematic conflict was directed not at external enemies but at fellow Mandalorians in civil war. The conflicts she had lived through as a child had not been abstract political events. They had been the specific and personal experience of a civilization consuming itself, of the culture that was supposed to represent the highest expression of warrior honor, producing exactly the kind of chaotic and uncontrolled violence that warriors were supposed to impose order upon rather than generate. She had drawn from this experience conclusions that were radical within the context of Mandalorian tradition, but entirely coherent within their own logic. If the warrior culture could produce this, then the warrior culture needed to be fundamentally reformed, not celebrated and preserved as it was. The new Mandalorian movement built genuine political power across the cities and administrative structures of the homeworld, attracting people who had reached similar conclusions from similar experiences. They developed a vision of Mandalore that was prosperous, pacifist by philosophical commitment, and integrated into the Republic's political structures as a willing and productive member, rather than as a reluctant subject or occasional mercenary supplier. The armor of their culture, which they did wear in some ceremonial contexts, was white, the color of peace within the Mandalorian symbolic vocabulary. They spoke the language and honored many of the traditions, but they had placed the warrior core of the creed in a museum, figuratively, if not always literally, and they intended to govern from that position. The opposition to this vision was never absent. Even during the periods when the new Mandalorian political structures appeared most secure in their hold on the homeworld's governance, there were those who looked at everything Satine and her allies had built and saw not the natural evolution of a living culture, but a fundamental betrayal of what it meant to be Mandalorian. The creed did not permit selective adherence. You did not take the language and the clan bonds and the ceremonial elements and leave behind the demand that a Mandalorian be a warrior. The Raisonnaire was not a menu from which you selected the requirements you found palatable. It was a whole, and partial compliance was not compliance at all. Among those who held this position, some were content to hold it politically and to work within whatever structures existed to express their disagreement. Others were not. House Vizsla was one of the great houses of Mandalorian tradition, its lineage stretching back through the culture's history to periods when the distinction between Mandalorian greatness and House Vizsla's specific contribution to it was difficult to draw clearly. They had produced warriors of significant reputation across multiple eras, and they held in their possession, by the time the tension between the new Mandalorian government and the traditionalist opposition became acute, one of the most significant objects in Mandalorian history, the Darksaber, a weapon unlike any other in its category, black-bladed, where all other lightsabers produced colored blades, flat and wide in its profile rather than round, created by the first Mandalorian ever to join the Jedi Order, a figure from a time so distant that his name existed more in legend than in verifiable record. The Darksaber had been taken from the Jedi Temple by members of House Vizsla long ago, and its possession was understood within Mandalorian tradition to carry specific meaning. It was not simply a weapon, it was a symbol of leadership that in some tellings of the culture's tradition carried the right to rule, to claim the allegiance of the clans in the way that only the Mandalore's mask had previously been understood to grant. The political organization that coalesced around the traditionalist opposition to Satine's government came to be called Death Watch. The name was chosen with an awareness of its own implications. They were watching over the warrior tradition, keeping vigil over what they saw as a dying way of life. And they intended for that death not to be permitted to complete itself. Death Watch operated as a shadow government in exile, maintaining training camps on worlds outside Satine's effective jurisdiction, and cultivating contacts within the Mandalorian population, who shared their fundamental critique of the new Mandalorian project, even if they were not ready to take up arms against it. Pre-Vizsla, who led Death Watch through the period of its greatest political significance, combined genuine personal fighting capability with the kind of organizational acumen that made him formidable as more than simply a talented warrior. He understood the politics of the situation, and he understood what was required to shift them. The society Satine built on Mandalore was not without genuine accomplishments. The planet experienced a period of economic development and civic stability under the new Mandalorian administration that had real and tangible benefits for the people living through it. Schools were built, trade relationships expanded. The grinding poverty and violence that had characterized the homeworld during the long periods when factional conflict made stable governance impossible gave way to something that looked and felt to the people benefiting from it like genuine progress. Satine was not simply a naive idealist who had failed to understand the world she lived in. She was a sophisticated political operator who had built a functioning state from conditions that made such building genuinely difficult. She simply believed, with a conviction she had earned through personal experience, that the state she was building was more worth having than the alternative that those who opposed her were offering. The argument she was making was not incoherent. It was, however, incomplete, in ways that the events that followed would make devastatingly clear. The wider galaxy's involvement in this internal Mandalorian struggle was one of the factors that made it particularly complicated and particularly painful for those caught within it. The Clone Wars, when they erupted and spread across the galaxy with the speed and totality of conflicts that have been carefully prepared in secret for a long time, created a context in which every power and every people had to make decisions about alignment that had consequences far beyond their immediate circumstances. Mandalore, under Satine's new Mandalorian government, attempted to maintain neutrality, which was a position that required constant effort to sustain in a galaxy where every significant power was actively pressuring neutral parties to choose sides. The Republic wanted Mandalorian resources and potentially Mandalorian warriors. The separatist movement saw in Mandalorian neutrality a potential asset that could be converted into active support with the right approach. And Death Watch, which had no interest in neutrality of any kind, was willing to deal with whoever offered the best path back to power on the homeworld. Pre-Vizsla's alliance with the Separatists, specifically with Count Dooku in the early phase of the Clone Wars, was a transaction rather than an ideological alignment. Death Watch needed outside support to project enough force to threaten the new Mandalorian government seriously. Dooku needed assets that operated outside the normal structures that Republic intelligence monitored. The arrangement made tactical sense for both parties without requiring either to genuinely believe in the other's cause. But it also exposed Death Watch to the particular risks of any arrangement with Sith-aligned partners, chief among which was the likelihood that those partners had their own objectives that did not fully align with Death Watch's, and that when those objectives diverged, the Sith-aligned side would not prioritize Death Watch's interests. The arrangement eventually collapsed, as such arrangements between Sith and would-be allies tended to collapse. Death Watch was driven off Mandalore and left to regroup, which they did with the adaptability that the warrior tradition had always rewarded. They continued to operate across the Outer Rim, recruiting, building capability, maintaining the argument that the new Mandalorian government was an aberration in the culture's history rather than its legitimate direction. And the Clone Wars continued to reshape the galaxy in ways that were creating new circumstances and new opportunities that no one, including Death Watch, had fully anticipated. The arrival of Darth Maul on the stage of Mandalorian politics was one of those circumstances that no existing plan had accounted for. Maul was a Zabrak who had been raised from childhood by Darth Sidious as a weapon, trained in Sith traditions and in a combat style of such explosive precision that his eventual defeat at the hands of Obi-Wan Kenobi had been experienced as a galactic shock by everyone who had witnessed or heard of it. His survival of that defeat through a combination of dark side connection and sheer will that bent what should have been the finality of his injury into something survivable, if barely so, had left him damaged in ways that went beyond the physical. His brother Savage Opress had eventually found him and helped him begin the long process of recovery. And Maul, reconstituted and reoriented, had looked at the galaxy and seen in the Mandalorians something that his particular combination of capabilities and ambitions made irresistible. Pre-Vizsla made the miscalculation that would define the final chapter of his story. He allowed Maul and Savage to join Death Watch's operations, presumably calculating that two former Sith-trained fighters with their combined combat capability represented an asset that could be leveraged without being submitted to. The plan was to use Maul's reputation and dark side abilities to destabilize the situation on Mandalore sufficiently to give Death Watch its opening, then discard Maul once the opening had been exploited. It was the same logic that had shaped Death Watch's alliance with Dooku, and it contained the same fundamental error. Sith-trained individuals are not assets to be leveraged and discarded. They are independent forces with their own objectives, and the moment they no longer need the arrangement they have entered into, they act accordingly. Maul moved against Satine's government in coordination with Death Watch, and the operation succeeded in a way that none of the parties involved had quite expected it to succeed. The new Mandalorian government fell. Satine herself was captured. The planet's governance passed into new hands in the rapid and violent manner that political change in the context of the Clone Wars tended to take. And then Maul, having achieved the outcome that Death Watch had been working toward for years, did exactly what Pre-Vizsla should have predicted, but had chosen not to predict. He challenged Pre-Vizsla to single combat for leadership of Death Watch and Mandalore itself. He invoked the Mandalorian tradition that said the strongest fighter led, and he put that tradition to the test in the most direct possible way. The fight was real. Pre-Vizsla was genuinely formidable, He wielded the Darksaber with the skill of someone who had trained with it for years and understood both its physical properties and its symbolic weight. He fought with the determination of a man defending everything he had built and everything he believed Mandalore should be. But Maul fought with something that went beyond technique and beyond determination. He fought with the cold and comprehensive violence of someone trained from childhood in a tradition that had stripped away everything except the will to win, and that will had survived everything, including his near destruction at Kenobi's hands. Pre Vizsla fell, and with him fell the vision of Mandalore that Death Watch had been built to achieve. Maul now held the Darksaber. He had won it by the logic of Mandalorian tradition, in the only way that tradition ultimately recognized. He installed a puppet government on Mandalore and used the planet as a base for building a criminal empire that served his own ambitions rather than any Mandalorian interest. Satine was executed. The planet that had defined a culture across thousands of years was being run by a former Sith apprentice who had no relationship to the Creed and no interest in what the Creed stood for. It was, within the framework of Mandalorian values, the worst possible outcome. Not defeat at the hands of an enemy who respected you enough to fight you honestly. Capture by someone who used your own traditions as tools without understanding or honoring what those traditions meant. The situation did not last in its initial form, because no situation in the Clone Wars era lasted in its initial form. Obi-Wan Kenobi came to Mandalore in a mission shaped by his personal history with Satine and his professional responsibility to the Republic's interests. The intervention that followed did not resolve the situation cleanly, because nothing in this period resolved cleanly. Maul retained enough of his position and his capability to escape the immediate consequences of Republic and Jedi attention. The Shadow Collective that he had been building, the criminal alliance that he used Mandalore as the base of operations for, continued for a time, and Mandalore itself remained in a condition of contested governance. Its people caught between the legacy of the new Mandalorian experiment, the traditionalist argument that Death Watch had represented, and the immediate reality of outside powers using their world as a staging ground for purposes that had nothing to do with Mandalorian interests. Bo-Katan Kryze was Satine's sister, and she had spent her own life making choices that were in almost every respect opposite to her sister's. Where Satine had rejected the warrior tradition and built her political project on its reform, Bo-Katan had embraced it. She had been a member of Death Watch, had fought alongside Pre Vizsla, had participated in the operation that brought down her own sister's government. These were facts about her past that she carried with the particular quality of people who have done things that their later selves could not fully defend, and who had nonetheless to continue living as themselves. She had broken with Maul after his execution of Pre Vizsla, recognizing in that moment that the path Death Watch had taken had led to the absolute worst version of the outcome it had claimed to be preventing. A non-Mandalorian wielding the Darksaber and using Mandalore as a tool, she had refused to kneel. The liberation of Mandalore came eventually, though not before additional suffering of a scale that added new layers to the planet's already layered history of conflict. A significant military operation in which clone forces operated alongside Mandalorian traditionalist warriors under Bo-Katan's command, cleared Maul's forces from the capital. The siege was brutal and costly in ways that the people of Mandalore absorbed with the particular quality of endurance that had always characterized the culture's relationship to hardship. Bo-Katan received the Darksaber at the conclusion of this operation, passed to her in a gesture that recognized her leadership of the liberation effort and her position as the closest thing to a legitimate Mandalorian claimant to political authority that the circumstances offered. she did not receive it by the traditional means that Mandalorian culture held as most legitimate. She received it as a transfer rather than as the prize of single combat. This distinction would matter later in ways that no one at that moment of hard-won liberation could fully have foreseen. The Republic's war ended in the way that the Republic itself ended. Not in military defeat, but in transformation from within. As the Supreme Chancellor, who had been covertly orchestrating events across the entire conflict, revealed himself as the Sith Lord who had been operating in plain sight, and declared the Republic's replacement by a galactic empire. For Mandalore, the change of galactic government was not an abstraction. It was an immediate and concrete political reality that had to be navigated without the institutional frameworks that had previously defined the relationship between the planet and the larger galaxy. The new Mandalorian government was gone. The traditional clan leadership was fragmented by everything that had happened. Bo-Katan held the Darksaber and had factional support, but not the unified legitimacy that the culture's traditions demanded of a Mandalore. And the Empire, which had its own ideas about how its component worlds should be governed, was paying attention. The years of imperial occupation of Mandalore were years that the culture would remember as among its darkest, though the full scope of what the Empire eventually chose to do with the planet was not immediately apparent in the occupation's early phase. The Empire imposed governors and administrative structures and the same relationship of subordination that it imposed on every world it controlled, and the Mandalorians resisted this in the various ways that occupied peoples resist: through passive non-compliance, through maintaining parallel structures of clan authority, alongside the official imperial administration, through the kind of cultural preservation that does not require formal organization because it is simply how people live when they refuse to stop being who they are. But the Empire grew impatient with Mandalorian resistance in the particular way that authoritarian powers grow impatient with peoples whose identity is too coherent to be simply overwritten by new administrative structures. And the decision that was eventually made in the imperial hierarchy regarding how to resolve the Mandalorian situation permanently was one of such comprehensive brutality that even by the standards of what the Empire was capable of, it occupied a category of its own. What the Mandalorians called the Night of 1,000 Tears, and the Empire called, to the extent that it was acknowledged at all, a pacification operation, involved the deployment of imperial forces and weaponry against the planet's surface and population centers at a scale designed not to achieve military objectives in any conventional sense, but to destroy, to break the culture by destroying enough of the people who carried it and enough of the physical infrastructure that supported it, that what remained would not constitute the threat that the Mandalorian identity represented to imperial place, order. The Beskar mines and forges, which had been among the most significant resources on the planet and among the most culturally significant objects in Mandalorian civilization, were targeted specifically. The Imperials understood, perhaps better than they understood most things about the cultures they occupied, that the armor was not simply armor, that destroying the means of its production was not simply an economic or military measure, but an attack on the culture's ability to reproduce itself in its own terms. The forges burned, the foundries were destroyed, and the people who had worked them, who had carried across generations the technical traditions that made Mandalorian Beskar what it was, were killed or scattered with the same comprehensive thoroughness that characterized every other aspect of the operation. The survivors of the Night of 1,000 Tears, scattered across the galaxy in numbers, and to distances that made the post-Malachor dispersal look small. That dispersal had been the consequence of military defeat and the imposition of conditions by a victor who intended to disable rather than to annihilate. This was different. The people now hiding themselves and their children across the furthest reaches of the Outer Rim and the unknown regions were not doing so because they had been militarily defeated and were awaiting the recovery of conditions that would allow return. They were doing so because the place they had made their home had been deliberately subjected to a scale of destruction that made return, in the immediate term, an act of survival rather than of restoration. Mandalore still existed as a planet. Its geography had not been removed, but the civilization that had occupied it had been broken in ways that survival alone could not immediately repair. Bo-Katan survived. She had been off the homeworld when the worst of the purge occurred, a fact that carried its own particular weight for a person who had dedicated herself to the planet's defense and liberation. She gathered what could be gathered and did what could be done, but the scope of what had been lost was larger than any individual's capacity to immediately address. The Darksaber, symbol of legitimate Mandalorian leadership, remained with her. Her claim to leadership, based on its possession, remained technically intact. But the people she was supposed to lead were scattered and diminished and traumatized in ways that made the politics of legitimacy secondary to the immediate realities of survival. Among those who survived and scattered were groups whose relationship to the creed expressed itself in ways that the broader Mandalorian culture did not always recognize as entirely standard. The Children of the Watch were one such group, their name itself carrying the implication of vigil, of keeping watch over something that might otherwise be lost. They were intensely traditional in their practice of the Rezolner, maintaining forms of the creed that had not been universal among Mandalorians for some time. Among them, the rule that the helmet was not to be removed in front of others was held not as a preference or a tradition, but as an absolute requirement, a sacred obligation that defined membership in the community as surely as any other aspect of the creed. They were Mandalorians in the fullest sense of what that word had ever meant, but they were Mandalorians who had retreated so deeply into the core of the tradition during the period of the Purge that they had become more insular than the broader culture had typically been. A foundling raised by one of these communities would grow into the warrior the galaxy would eventually come to know as Din Djarin. He had been rescued from the chaos of the Purge as a child, taken in by Mandalorian warriors at a moment when his own people had been lost to Imperial violence, and raised within the strict, traditional framework of the Children of the Watch, as though he had been born into it. He grew up knowing the creed as the whole of what Mandalore meant, knowing the helmet rule as absolute, knowing the bonds of clan and armor, and the Rezolner as the shape of a life properly lived. He became a bounty hunter in the mercenary tradition that had sustained Mandalorian warriors through every period of the culture's history, when large-scale military campaigns were not available as the primary expression of what they were. He was skilled and disciplined and deeply committed to the code he had been raised by. And the galaxy, in its way, was preparing to ask more of him than he had yet imagined being asked. The events that set Din Djarin on the path that would eventually intersect with the broader story of Mandalorian restoration began with a job. A target, an asset to be acquired for a client whose identity and ultimate purposes were not fully disclosed at the time of the contract, because that was how the business worked, and because asking too many questions about clients' ultimate intentions was not generally considered a professional quality in a bounty hunter operating in the Outer Rim. The target turned out to be a child, a being of the same species as the great Jedi Master Yoda, whose reputation was sufficiently enormous that even people with no relationship to the Jedi Order had absorbed a basic understanding of what it meant to be a member of that species. The child was Force-sensitive in a way that was obvious, even to someone without Force ability themselves. And Din Djarin could not deliver the child to the client. This decision, made in a moment and at a cost that he had not calculated when he took the contract, set in motion a series of events whose scope expanded far beyond what any individual decision usually produces. The child, whom he would come to call Grogu before the galaxy at large learned that name, became the center of a struggle that drew in the remnants of the Empire, the emerging structures of the New Republic, and eventually the people and traditions of Mandalore itself. Din Djarin moved through the galaxy as a warrior operating in the oldest Mandalorian tradition, protecting someone in his care with everything he had, without institutional backing and without a clear path to any outcome he could predict in advance. He found allies in unexpected forms. He made enemies by the nature of his commitment. He learned things about himself and about what he had been raised to be that were complicated in ways the children of the Watch had not prepared him for. The Mandalorian way had always held that the foundling was to be protected as one's own. This was not a conditional obligation. It did not expire when the circumstances became inconvenient or dangerous, or when maintaining it required sacrificing other things that also mattered. Din Djarin lived this principle in a way that was unremarkable from the perspective of the Creed and remarkable from the perspective of almost everything else in the galaxy that he moved through. He faced enemies who outnumbered him and outgunned him, and had access to resources that vastly exceeded what an individual bounty hunter could muster. And he faced them with the particular quality of resolution that comes, not from calculating that you will probably win, but from having decided that the obligation you are honoring does not include a clause that releases you when the odds go sufficiently against you. He nearly died for the child many times. He would have died for the child without hesitation. The Creed had prepared him for this, not by making him reckless, but by making him clear. Some things mattered more than survival, and you knew which things they were because you had been taught to know, and you had chosen to continue knowing every day since. Bo-Katan crossed his path more than once during this period, and their interactions carried the weight of the different relationships to Mandalorian tradition that they each represented. She was of the broader culture, the kind of Mandalorian who removed her helmet and navigated the political complexity of the post-Purge world with the pragmatism that the situation demanded. He was of the children of the Watch, to whom her approach to the Creed looked like incomplete compliance, a picking and choosing from obligations that were not supposed to be optional. These two versions of what it meant to be Mandalorian, in conversation and in tension with each other, were a reflection of something that had always been true about the culture. The Creed was not simple. Its application to the conditions of actual life required interpretation, and not everyone's interpretation agreed, and the disagreements about interpretation sometimes ran deeper than the more obvious disputes about territory or political authority. The Darksaber passed between hands during this period in ways that complicated the already complicated question of legitimate Mandalorian leadership. Din Djarin came to hold it through the logic of combat, having defeated the person who held it in a confrontation where the outcome was determined by the principles the tradition recognized. He had not sought the Darksaber or its implications. He was not a claimant to Mandalorian political leadership in any sense he had ever imagined for himself. But the tradition was clear. and the tradition said that the dark saber went with the warrior who had taken it, and that what the dark saber implied about authority went with the dark saber. Bo-Katan, who had carried the weapon and the claim associated with it for years, now did not. The asymmetry was painful and politically significant in ways that were not resolved simply by noting what the tradition technically said. The path back to Mandalore itself was not straightforward and was not completed by any single act of will or force. The homeworld had continued in the condition that the Great Purge had left it. The surface heavily damaged, the population reduced to whatever had survived and could return, the administrative and cultural infrastructure that a civilization requires rebuilt only partially and under conditions of ongoing difficulty. The armorer, who led the Children of the Watch and served as keeper of the creed within that community, had been clear about one thing through all the complications of the period. The way forward, whatever it looked like in its particulars, required the retaking of Mandalore, not simply as a political objective, as a cultural necessity. The creed that tied the Mandalorian people to their world required that the world be inhabited by the people who claimed it. Dispossession was not a permanent state. It was a condition to be corrected. The retaking happened, eventually, through a combination of forces that would not have been predictable from any single earlier point in the story. Din Djarin, Bo-Katan, the disparate Mandalorian warriors who had been scattered across the galaxy and maintained the creed through years of hardship, and even figures from outside the culture who had become connected to its fate through the complicated threads of what the Clone Wars and the Imperial era had produced. The engagement was costly. Retaking a world always is, and Mandalore had been prepared against the possibility of return by those who had interests in preventing it. But the warriors who fought for it fought with the accumulated weight of everything the culture represented, with the knowledge of what had been taken from them and what returning meant beyond the immediate military objective. Bo-Katan eventually received the Darksaber by the means that Mandalorian tradition held as most legitimate, not by transfer or political agreement, but by combat, the tradition's original and irreducible standard. The symbolic completion of this was not merely ceremonial. Within the framework of values the culture had operated by since the first Mandalore set foot on the planet in the name of the Tong people, the manner of acquisition mattered as much as the acquisition itself. A claim built on the right foundation was a claim that held. A claim built on the wrong foundation was always vulnerable to the challenge that its foundation deserved. She had spent years carrying a weapon whose legitimacy the tradition questioned, and had lived with the particular discomfort that brings to someone who understands the tradition well enough to know exactly what the questioning means. Now the discomfort was resolved, and the resolution had come in the only way that would have satisfied the requirements the culture placed on such things. She stood on Mandalorian ground, holding a Mandalorian symbol, having earned it by Mandalorian standards. Whatever came next, it would come from that foundation. And so the people returned to the world that had always been theirs, carrying everything that the millennia had added to what they carried when they first arrived. The armor was still worn, the language was still spoken, the creed was still the creed. Its 6 requirements, still the measure of what it meant to belong to this culture, rather than simply to know about it or to admire it from outside. The clans had survived the purge in the way the culture had always survived, everything directed at it, by being more durable in their fundamental nature than whatever was applied against them. And the homeworld, damaged and scarred, and bearing the marks of what had been done to it, was still Mandalore, still the planet whose name the people shared, still the place where the story had its center. Whatever else the history had added to that center, across thousands of years of accumulated event. What the history of the Mandalorian people ultimately tells, from the Taung warriors who refused to accept dispossession from Notron and went looking for a world that would be truly theirs, through all the crusades and the wars and the great Mandalores and the long silences and the purges and the returns, is something that the culture itself had always known and expressed in the terms of the creed, rather than in the terms of philosophical abstraction. Identity is not a fragile thing if it is genuinely held. Culture does not dissolve under pressure if the pressure is applied to something that was built to receive pressure. A people who have made the willingness to be tested the foundation of their entire civilization will not be destroyed by tests. They will be defined by them. The Mandalorians were never simply warriors. That understanding, which outsiders consistently failed to fully reach, was perhaps the central misunderstanding that every enemy of the culture had made in its long history. The fighting was real. The capability was real. The willingness to engage in conflict without flinching and to face death with a philosophical equanimity that came from believing you had lived as you were supposed to live, that was all real. But it was in service of something. It was the expression of a set of values that ran deeper than tactics or military organization or the technology of Beskar armor. It was a statement about what a life was for and what made a person worth being, and what the bonds between people meant when they were genuine and maintained across every kind of adversity. The creed asked things of you. The creed asked hard things of you, constantly, without exception, without allowing for the comfortable periods when demands might reasonably be relaxed. And in asking those hard things, it gave back something that softer arrangements could not offer. It gave you the knowledge that what you were, you had earned. That the identity you carried was not simply inherited but actively chosen. Every day, through the living of it, the galaxy across its long history has been full of warriors. It has never been particularly full of cultures that turned the warrior's vocation into something that could survive the loss of every external condition while remaining intact in the people who carried it. The Mandalorians did this. Not once, not in any single period of adversity that could be cited as the definitive test and the definitive proof. They did it repeatedly, across thousands of years, under conditions that would have been sufficient to erase most peoples from the historical record entirely. And they did it not through any miracle or any special dispensation, but through the same mechanism that had always been their most fundamental resource. They held to the creed. They wore the armor and spoke the language and defended those in their care and raised their children in the Mandalorian way and contributed to the clan and answered when the Mandalore called. 6 things. 6 requirements. Simple enough to be memorized by a child and deep enough to hold an entire civilization across the full span of its history. That was Mandalore. That was what it had always been. And somewhere in the galaxy, right now, a warrior in Beskar iron is proving that it still is.